James trudged through the desolate, arid land of the alien planet. The heat was unbearable, the sun blazing overhead like a cruel overseer. His mission had gone wrong from the start, and now his ship was nothing but a pile of twisted metal, wrecked beyond repair. With no way to contact Earth and supplies running low, he was on a survival mission of his own. The planet, Orcs 7, had seemed promising on the initial scans, but its barren surface was unforgiving. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, sand, rocks, and nothing else. No signs of civilization, no hope. But as James continued to search the area for any signs of shelter or water, something caught his eye. A figure, half hidden among the rocks and tall, dry grass. At first, he thought it was a trick of the sun, a mirage, but as he approached, he realized it was a person. A woman. She was kneeling on the ground, her head tilted slightly, as though waiting for something. Her skin shimmered under the harsh sun, soft violet with delicate markings running across her face and arms. She was beautiful, but the signs of weakness were clear. Her skin, once vibrant, now looked pale, almost translucent from lack of sustenance. She didn't seem to notice him approach, her eyes vacant, staring off into the distance. James's heart raced. This was not just another traveler. This was someone in desperate need of help. He rushed forward, his boots crunching over the dry earth as he knelt beside her. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough but full of concern. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. The woman's eyes fluttered, her violet gaze meeting his for a brief moment before she weakly recoiled, as if not sure if he was real. She had clearly been suffering from dehydration and starvation. Her breathing was shallow, and there was no sign of any injuries that might have caused this. "Please," she whispered, barely audible, her voice fragile. "Water, food." James's mind raced. He had nothing to give her but the few rations he had left for himself. His own survival had been a struggle, but the sight of this alien woman, clearly on the edge of death, stirred something in him he hadn't felt before. Compassion. Without thinking, he took the last of his water and offered it to her. She took it with trembling hands, drinking greedily, though it wasn't enough. Her fragile form was trembling, and James could see the desperation in her eyes. She was barely holding on. "Don't worry," James said softly. "I'll get you out of here. I won't leave you." The woman tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. Her eyes fluttered again, and she slumped against him, unable to hold herself up any longer. James wrapped an arm around her, gently lifting her into his arms. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm with determination. As he started to move, she mumbled something, her voice so faint he barely caught it. I'm not from here." James didn't respond. There was no time for questions. His priority was getting her to safety, wherever that was. As he carried her, he couldn't help but wonder about her, who she was, where she came from, and how she ended up stranded on this unforgiving planet. But for now, all that mattered was her survival. He would do whatever it took. James carried the alien woman carefully, his arms strong but his heart heavy. He had to keep moving, the urgency of her condition pressing on him. She was light, almost too light, like she hadn't eaten or drunk anything for days. Her skin, which had once shimmered under the harsh sun, now looked dull, a sign of dehydration and malnutrition. Every step he took felt like a race against time. The heat of Orcs 7 was unrelenting, but James pushed forward, focused only on finding shelter. His thoughts raced as he tried to come up with a plan. His ship was still a wreck, and there was nothing around them for miles but dust and rocks. There had to be something, anything, that could help her. After what felt like hours, James finally spotted a small cave, hidden from view by the thick brush. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shade and shelter. He quickened his pace, relieved to see some sort of refuge ahead. As he reached the entrance, he gently lowered the alien woman to the ground, her body too weak to do anything but slump against the cool rock. She barely seemed aware of her surroundings, her breathing shallow. James ran his hand through his hair, trying to steady his nerves. He needed to act fast. He rummaged through his pack and pulled out the last of his rations, but when he offered them to her, she just weakly shook her head. Her lips parted, and in a soft voice, she spoke again, barely audible. "I can't. Take it. I'm not," she whispered, her eyes fluttering as though the effort was too much. James frowned, his hand hovering over her. He had seen people in this state before, too weak to even accept help, too far gone to remember the most basic needs. It was a feeling he hated, the helplessness of knowing that, no matter what he did, it might not be enough. "I'll stay with you," James said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're going to make it through this, okay? I won't leave you." Her violet eyes flickered, barely staying open, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. It was as though she heard him, even if she couldn't speak. Her hand weakly grasped his, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of strength she had left. James sat beside her, keeping her hand in his. He wasn't a doctor, and he didn't have all the answers, but he had what mattered most right now, time and care. He gently wiped the sweat from her brow and tried again to give her some of his water. "Please," he whispered, "just drink a little more." She hesitated, but her parched lips parted once again, taking the water in small sips, barely enough to make a difference. But it was something. It was the first step. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, and James stayed at her side, keeping her hydrated, giving her space to rest. The night came quickly, and the desert's cool air swept through the cave, bringing some relief from the scorching heat. As he sat there, watching over her, he felt a quiet connection to the woman beside him. She wasn't just some stranger. There was something more to her, something deep. The alien woman, still struggling to stay conscious, squeezed his hand lightly. And this time, her voice was stronger, though filled with exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, an emotion that Lucas couldn't quite place. James smiled softly, squeezing her hand in return. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what anyone would do." But in his heart, he knew it was more than that. There was something about her, something that called to him in a way he couldn't explain. He hadn't just saved her from dying on this lonely planet. He had saved something more. And whatever came next, he would face it with her, by her side. The following morning, the sun rose high over the alien desert, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. James sat by the entrance of the cave, watching the sky slowly shift from dark purple to soft blue. The air was still cool, but he knew it wouldn't last. Torix 7's heat would return soon. Inside the cave, the alien woman was still unconscious, her breathing slow and steady. James had kept her hydrated throughout the night, but he knew she wasn't out of danger yet. She needed more food, more care, but he had little left. The crash had left him with almost no supplies, and the chance of finding anything here on this barren world seemed impossible. He stood up and stretched, trying to shake off the fatigue. His muscles were sore from the long days of carrying her, but he couldn't stop. Not now. As he turned to check on her, he saw her eyes flutter open, her violet gaze immediately seeking his. A small wave of relief washed over James. At least she was waking up. "Hey," he said gently, sitting beside her. "How are you feeling?" Lyra's lips parted as she struggled to speak, her voice raspy. "Thirsty," she whispered. James quickly grabbed his water canteen and helped her drink. She took small sips, her hands shaking. He felt his heart soften. "It's okay. Take your time. You're safe now." She nodded, her eyes still unfocused, but there was something more in them now. Gratitude, and something else James couldn't quite place. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice stronger than before. I thought I was going to die." James smiled, his voice filled with warmth. "You're not dying. You're going to be okay. Just rest." Lyra closed her eyes, letting out a quiet sigh. but she kept her hand in his. Her skin was still pale, and she was far from strong, but the faintest spark of life had returned to her. James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had fought through the worst of it, and now she was here, holding on. "I owe you my life," Lyra said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for what you've done." James hesitated for a moment before responding. "You don't need to repay me. I just did what anyone would do. But there is something you can do." Lyra turned her head slightly, her violet eyes curious. "What is it?" "I need to know more about you," James said, his voice steady. "I need to understand where you come from, what happened to your people. I can't help you if I don't understand your world." Lyra's expression softened, and she took a slow breath before answering. "My name is Lyra, and I come from Scifi. It was a peaceful planet, but the war came and took everything. My people fought to the end, but we were overwhelmed. I was one of the last survivors. I never thought I would find someone like you." James listened intently as she spoke. Scifi sounded like a beautiful place, peaceful, like Earth, but everything had been destroyed in the war. The weight of her words sank in, and he understood her pain, her need for someone to lean on. "Don't worry," James said softly. "I'll help you. Whatever it takes, you won't be alone." Lyra's eyes brightened slightly, though the sadness remained. "Thank you. I won't forget this." They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet of the cave surrounding them. James realized that this was more than just a rescue. This was the start of something new, something they would both have to build together. He wasn't sure what the future held, but with Lyra by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The days passed slowly as James and Lyra adjusted to their new routine in the cave. Though they had no communication with the outside world, the bond between them deepened. Lyra, though still weak, had regained some of her strength thanks to James's care. She was eating more, drinking more, and her movements were becoming steadier with each passing day. James had set up a small camp inside the cave, trying to make the best of their situation. He had found some basic tools in his pack, though nothing would be enough to get them off this planet. But Lyra was a quick learner, and her knowledge of survival in harsh conditions surprised him. She used her skills to help him gather food, finding edible plants and fruit in the surrounding area. Despite the constant feeling of isolation, they were managing. But something had changed in James. He couldn't ignore the growing pull between them. Lyra's beauty and grace were undeniable, but it wasn't just that. It was the way she cared for him, the way she opened up about her past, and the strength she had shown in the face of so much loss. One evening, after a long day of gathering food, they sat by the small fire they'd built. The crackling of the flames filled the silence between them. Lyra had her eyes closed, her face softened by the glow of the firelight. James studied her, thinking about what she had said, that she didn't want to be alone anymore. She caught his gaze and smiled faintly, her violet eyes glowing softly in the firelight. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. James hesitated, then looked away, uncomfortable with the honesty he was about to share. "I was thinking about how different this is from anything I've ever known," he said quietly. "I'm used to being on my own, but with you here, it feels like I'm not. I've never had anyone depend on me like this." Lyra's smile deepened, and she reached out to take his hand. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has," she said. "I owe you everything. You saved my life." "You don't owe me anything," James replied, his voice low. I just couldn't leave you to die out there. It wasn't a choice for me." Lyra's eyes softened, her fingers gently holding his hand. "You say that, but you've given me so much more. You've given me hope. You've given me a future." James felt a knot form in his chest. Her words weighed on him. They both had lost so much, but somehow, together, they had found something. He didn't know what it was yet, whether it was hope, love, or just survival, but he knew it was important. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not just the alien woman from another world, but someone who had been through unimaginable loss, who had no one left to turn to. And in that moment, James realized something. He wanted to be the person she could turn to. He wanted to offer her more than just survival. "I can't promise you the world, Lyra," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I can promise that I won't leave you. Not now, not ever." Lyra squeezed his hand, her gaze steady. "That's all I need." They sat in silence, their hands still intertwined, as the fire crackled and the stars outside their cave lit up the night sky. The world around them may have been broken, but for now, in that small moment, they were whole. The weeks went by, and James and Lyra continued to make a life for themselves on Torix 7. The barren planet that had once seemed so empty now felt a little less lonely. Together, they had found a rhythm, gathering food, tending the small fire, and talking late into the night about their pasts, their hopes, and the future they might build. Despite the harsh conditions, they had found a sense of peace. Lyra was getting stronger each day, her skin returning to its natural shimmer, her energy growing. Her laughter, though soft, had become more frequent, filling the silence of their cave with warmth. James had never imagined he would find companionship in this place, but now he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. One afternoon, as they sat together by the entrance of the cave, watching the sun dip behind the horizon, Lyra turned to James, her expression serious. "James," she said softly, "I've been thinking." James raised an eyebrow. "What about?" "I want to go with you," she said, her violet eyes meeting his. "When we leave this planet, I want to be with you. Forever." James's heart skipped a beat. He had thought about it. About Earth, about the future. But hearing her say it out loud felt different. "You want to come with me?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Lyra nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I've never had a choice in my life, James. I've always followed orders, always done what I was told. But when you saved me, I realized something. I have the power to choose now. I can choose where I go, who I'm with. And I choose you." James was silent for a moment, his mind racing. He had always believed that his life was defined by duty, by missions, by surviving. But Lyra's words challenged that belief. She was right. She had no one left to turn to, no place to call home, but she had chosen him. And in that moment, he realized he wanted the same. "I've never been good at promises," James said quietly, his voice steady. "But I promise you, Lyra, that I'll be with you. I won't leave you. We'll figure this out together." Lyra's face softened with a smile, her eyes full of gratitude. "That's all I need, James. I don't need Earth. I don't need anything but you." James felt something shift in his chest. The weight of the universe seemed to lift, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone in the world. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know exactly what the future held. He just knew that with Lyra by his side, he could face anything. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, the last light of the sun fading into the darkness, James made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened next, no matter how difficult the journey ahead, he would protect Lyra. He would give her the life she deserved, the life they both deserved. And in that moment, under the stars of Torix 7, James realized that home wasn't a place. It was the people you shared it with. The days on Torix 7 were coming to an end. James and Lyra had spent weeks in the cave, finding what little peace they could on the desolate planet. Despite its harsh conditions, it had become their sanctuary. But now, the time had come to leave. James had repaired his ship as best as he could with the limited supplies he had, and though it wasn't in perfect condition, it was ready for takeoff. He had been preparing for this moment for some time now, but as he looked at Lyra, the woman he had come to care deeply for, the reality of what lay ahead began to settle in. Earth was a long way from this broken world, and the journey would be difficult. But it was a journey they would take together. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. He had no idea what would await them on Earth. Would she be accepted? Would she feel out of place, surrounded by people so different from her? Lyra looked up at him, her violet eyes steady and full of determination. "Unsure," she replied. "You've shown me kindness, something I thought I had lost forever. I don't care about Earth's people or their customs. All I care about is being with you." James smiled at her, his heart swelling with affection. "You're all I need too." With that, they began their final preparations. James helped Lyra onto the ship, and together they made their way to the cockpit. As the ship lifted off, the planet of Torix 7 began to fade behind them, the vast desert shrinking beneath them. They were leaving behind the planet where they had found each other, but their future was ahead of them, unknown and filled with possibilities. The journey was long, and there were moments of quiet, peaceful reflection as they passed through the stars. Lyra spent much of the time looking out the window, watching the universe unfold before her. Earth was still a long way off, but she had never felt so certain about anything in her life. "I know Earth is your home," Lyra said one evening, breaking the silence. "But I want to make a new home with you. Wherever we go, whatever we do, I want to be with you." James took her hand, his voice soft but full of conviction. "We'll make a home, Lyra. Wherever we are, as long as we're together, we'll make it work." For the first time in weeks, Lyra smiled in a way that made James's heart ache with warmth. It was a smile of hope, of new beginnings. It wasn't about the past, or the pain they had both endured. It was about the future, about what they would create together. As Earth grew closer, they both felt a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Would they be accepted? Could they build a life together? There were no guarantees, no promises. But as they looked out at the endless sky, they knew one thing for certain. They had each other, and that was all they needed. The ship entered Earth's atmosphere, the bright blue planet growing larger by the second. It wasn't just a new world waiting for them. It was the beginning of their new life. Together. James looked at Lyra, a quiet promise in his eyes. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together. This is just the beginning." Lyra nodded, her hand still in his. They didn't know what the future held, but they were ready to face it together. As the ship descended into Earth's atmosphere, the landscape below was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. The blue and green planet sparkled with life, a stark contrast to the barren desert of Torix 7. Her heart beat faster in her chest as she gazed out the window, unsure of what to expect, but feeling an overwhelming sense of anticipation. "Do you think they'll accept me?" Lyra asked, her voice tinged with both hope and nervousness. Earth was so different from her homeworld. The people, the culture, everything was unknown to her. But she had made her choice. She had chosen to be with James. James glanced at her, his expression calm but full of warmth. "I don't know what will happen, Lyra, but what I do know is that no matter what, you're not alone. You have me." Lyra smiled at his reassurance, though the worry still lingered in her eyes. She had been through so much, lost everything she had known, and now she was placing her trust in a world she didn't understand. But the connection they shared, the bond they had built during their time on Torix 7, gave her hope. "We'll make it work," James continued, squeezing her hand. Together. The ship touched down softly, the hum of the engine slowing as they entered the atmosphere. Lyra could feel the vibrations of the ship, a familiar, comforting sensation after so many days in space. The landing was smooth, and as the ship came to a stop, they both sat in silence for a moment. James turned to her, his face soft with compassion, ready to see what Earth has in store for us. Lyra nodded, her heart racing with excitement and fear. She didn't know what to expect, but she was ready. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She had James by her side, and that was enough. Together, they stepped out of the ship and onto Earth's soil. The air was different, cooler, fresher. It smelled of life and possibility. The Earth's skies were clear. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and in the distance, the sound of birds filled the air. Lyra looked around, her eyes wide with awe. It was everything she had dreamed of and more. A new world, full of unknowns, but also full of promise. James watched her, a proud smile on his face. "Welcome to Earth, Lyra." She turned to him, her smile warm and filled with gratitude. "Thank you, James, for everything. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to share it with you." He held out his hand, and Lyra took it, her fingers trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. Together, they began to walk into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges and joys Earth would bring them. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt at peace. With James by her side, she wasn't alone anymore, and whatever the future held, they would face it together, hand in hand, a team stronger than anything the universe could throw at them. The adventure had just begun.